audio, that works too.
We are
Just a little
officially
dog
recording.
barking among friends.
Yeah.
We are officially recording, so we're good.
Good stuff. All right.
It's an official Zoom call without a dog barking or a cat walking across the screen.
There you go.
Give us some time. My schnauzers are warming up.
We were hosting a webinar in Green Banks yesterday, and there was someone who was doing construction. And for some reason, we couldn't figure out who needed to be muted. And so there's this constant hammering in the background for about 20 minutes. It was pretty rough, but we ended up getting through it.
I had, I guess it's been 2 weeks ago now, I had a day when I had like 3 Zoom calls and they were installing solar cells on my roof. And of course, every time they banged anything into the roof with a hammer, it set the schnauzers off. So it was quite an eventful day.
Oh, well, how's your new system?
Well, Monday they're going to, I get the building inspector and so it'll be officially hooked up, but the app says it's supplying 57% of my power even on a cloudy day. So I'm pretty encouraged.
Glad to hear it. Great. Well, I see folks are trickling in, and I see we've got Delegate Brooks on as well. How are you doing, Delegate?
Good.
And
Good. What about yourself, David?
fantastic. So we may as well go ahead and get started. As I mentioned on the top of the call, if you are not a speaker, please go ahead and mute yourself. So the conversation is going to go in 2 parts. The first of which is going to be a legislative recap. So Delegate Brooks and Jason Weintraub and I are going to talk about some of the key legislation that came through Annapolis over the course of the last few months. And then we'll turn it over to the rest of the Gordon Feinblatt team, who will talk about some key regulatory changes and what that means for C&I and community solar permitting, as well as utility scale permitting in Maryland and beyond. So this is a great conversation about solar in Maryland, and we have the perfect team of folks to walk us through it. If you have questions, just be sure to pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And at the end, we'll also have an opportunity for folks to give live questions. This webinar is supposed to run until about 1:15 or 1:30. Once again, my name is David Murray. I am the Executive Director of the Chesapeake Solar and Storage Association. We represent all kinds of solar here in the state of Maryland. And we recently rebranded from MDVC to CHESA because 8 letters was one too many, and we wanted to encompass energy storage and the value that it provides to the energy system. So I'm going to first introduce my 2 panelists for the first part. First of all, Delegate Benjamin Brooks of Baltimore County, who represents District 10. Delegate Brooks was first elected in 2014 and is the Deputy Majority Whip in the House. He's a member of the House Economic Matters Committee, and he's the chair of the Public Utilities Subcommittee, which, as you all can expect, manages a lot of key legislation that's relevant to both the solar and energy storage industry. Delegate Brooks has been a longtime friend of the solar industry, not to mention is a solar homeowner himself. We also have Jason Weintraub of Gordon Feinblatt. And Jason has experience first at Department of Legislative Services and has served over 8 years in the House of Delegates Speaker's office, first with the late Mike Bush, and then most recently the present Speaker of the House, Adrian Jones. He now serves as counsel to the Baltimore-based law firm Gordon Feinblatt. And of course, Jason will be hearing from more of your colleagues in the second half of the discussion. So first, I want to start with you, Delegate Brooks. I'm curious to know your general reflections on this legislative session. Obviously, with COVID, it was a pretty big change. So I'm curious, from the lawmakers' perspective, what some of the challenges were and what you see some of the key successes coming out of the unique 2021 session.
Thanks, David. Yeah, and I want to extend a good morning to everyone. Yeah, this session would be coined as being unprecedented in the sense that, you know, we had to get back to work amidst the pandemic, and then a lot of social issues, you know, that were pressing, just to say the least, you know. And we entered the session with a lot of work to do, and I'm proud to say that you know, with all the challenges that we had, we were able to get some legislation through. You know, in the Senate, there were over 1,183 bills introduced. In the House, 1,588 bills introduced. You know, and we worked diligently to try to make sure that, you know, things could pass both chambers. Of course, you know, that's what's got to be done in order to get the legislation through. Right now, there's been 93 bills that have been enacted, you know, either by the governor not signing or signing off on it. You know, we take our jobs seriously, and of course, as you mentioned earlier about energy and solar, reducing our carbon footprint. You know, trying to adhere to all of the mandates that we did in the CEDR in 2019. You know, we want to do whatever we can do to make sure that we are being able to take advantage of and then adhere to those standards, albeit some folks might say they were lofty, but those standards that were being put forth just here again to reduce our carbon footprint. You know, some of the bills, one of the bills in particular that we addressed was SB 65, and that was the biomass bill, which reduces the use of or remove, let's say, black liquor from tier 1. You know, and that was somewhat challenging, but if you look back before. One of the reasons why that was in tier 1 was the fact that it provided jobs, you know, which is very important to Maryland. But since the subsequent closing of Luke Mill, of course, then that sort of removed that major concern that labor had about those jobs. So that being said, we were able to get that bill passed this year. Another one that comes to mind was HB 569. That was the electricity net neutrality metering bill, you know, and that bill, what it did, it doubled the state capacity for residential rooftop and solar community projects, you know. So that was another one. And one other one comes to mind would be HB 507. That was the Clean Water Commerce Act, you know. And as amended, that bill stopped the sunset on and then increased the allocation of for the Bay Restoration Fund. So we are doing, and I as I've always said, Maryland has been a leader when it comes to clean energy, and then I think we by the bills that we introduced and got passed this year, it would allow us to continue to carry that mantra. You know, we're serious about what we do here so far as clean energy is concerned, and I think these bills would somewhat validate that seriousness. Yes.
Absolutely, and thank you, Delegate. And I want to get back to SB 65 in a moment, but I first want to hear Jason's thoughts. Jason, you obviously were part of 8 in-person sessions, and going into this next one, we were told, you know, there were a number of really major priorities this year, despite it being an unusual session. What were some of your big takeaways as it relates to energy, you know, with the Climate Solutions Act not really getting across the finish line? What were some of your reactions on some of the challenges, and how did some of the bills that Delegate Brooks mentioned, how did those get through? What were some of those underlying forces that really allowed for some key pieces of legislation to get across the finish line in time?
Thanks for having me, Delegate Brooks. Good to see you. As Delegate Brooks mentioned, it was sort of an unprecedented session. You had 700 bills pre-filed before they even got started down there. And every committee honestly seemed to be taking on substantive legislation. Sometimes down in Annapolis, there's one or two committees that are busy with major sort of legislative priorities. And I think when you see economic matters, environment, transportation, taking on big bills like climate solutions, black liquor finally making its way through, folks I think were busy every day of the 90 days that they were down there. It was a little bit interesting being sort of on this side for my first session. Everything was remote. The ability to sort of influence and advocate on the outside was a little bit more challenging. But I think, honestly, as Delegate Brooks mentioned, particularly for black liquor, the closure of the Luke Mill plant, I think, played a key role in getting that bill across. Obviously, in years past, you'd have a bunch, hundreds of folks down there protesting who were afraid of losing their job. And I think this year, the fact that the plant's closed, the recs were coming from out-of-state operators. I think it was sort of the legislature saw that it was time that they could make that call to remove black liquor. And as far as some of the other bills, I think it was climate solutions, I think, is the one that, I think we'll talk about later as far as not making it across the goal line. But I think part of the reason was it's hard to sort of negotiate and compromise over Zoom, and the ability to get all these bills across was a little bit challenging, but there's certainly time for discussions for next year as well.
Absolutely. And Delegate Brooks introduced SB 65, and that bill is really critical for a lot of our solar industry members for a couple of reasons. One is, as both Jason and the delegate mentioned, it removes black liquor from Tier 1 eligibility, meaning it creates demand across PJM for cleaner sources of energy, be it wind and solar. But also it included a slight adjustment to the solar carve-out that accounts for some of the permitting challenges that we've had. The solar industry's also grappled a bit with the pandemic, slowing some commercial deployment down. And so it kept SREC prices a bit higher than they otherwise would have, and pushed out the carve-out a bit. And for a number of these projects, especially folks that are operating in the commercial and industrial sector, this really meant a lot. I had a number of folks that had projects on ice, and then they saw this bill moving through the legislature and said, we might be able to make this investment, and we might be able to go solar in Maryland. And we had initial success in the Senate, and then there were politics around some other resources that really kind of created this initial block in the Senate. And so we took our issue over to the House, and that brings us to Delegate Brooks. We had SB 65 that already crossed over, and so our folks sat down with Delegate Brooks and explained to him the issue, and he got it done. So Delegate, I was wondering if you could give folks a little bit of insight on some of the politics around the RPS and how you were able to maneuver SB 65 and specifically the change to the solar carve-out through, and have it ultimately pass with little drama by sine die.
Yeah. Well, as you know, it's always about the negotiating and getting people to buy in into that particular idea, and here again, as we know, I think Maryland and probably one other state were the only two states that had black liquor in the RPS, so, and here again, the reason that Maryland did it was because of the jobs, and of course, we want labor's buy-in, and we want to make sure that we're by us trying to reduce that here again, that carbon footprint, to move away from these dirty fossil fuels, we want to mitigate any potential consequences to other say job seekers here in Maryland. The retirement of the closing of that Luke Mill plant, that sort of made that lift a little easier, because as all before we were saying, we didn't want to lose those jobs, but since that plant had closed, that sort of invalidated that particular argument. So here again, the lift was a lot easier. So, yeah.
Great. And Jason, I'm curious to know your perspective on how the solar industry has evolved as a kind of lobbying entity in Annapolis. You would have been there since really we passed the first solar carve out ever, and now you've seen it evolve to where we have all these different segments. We had hundreds of solar workers in Annapolis during the Clean Energy Jobs Act days. There were dozens of bills that related to solar this session. Can you talk a little bit about how you see our industry evolving in Maryland and where you expect to go?
Sure. I mean, honestly, I think my first session down in Annapolis was 2009, and I was, drafting bills and writing fiscal and policy notes. And when you go back to sort of solar legislation at the time, it was trying to get property tax exemptions, sales tax exemptions on sort of solar equipment. The RPS had just gotten off the ground, and I think legislators didn't really know what you were talking about for the most part, right? You've got about 200 legislators there, and a lot of them were probably looking at you with a skeptical eye as you're trying to get the RPS off the ground. But I think the industry has collectively sort of coalesced around all of its members and all of the jobs and all of the employees, and is now using like a unified voice in advocating down in Annapolis. And I think that helps, especially when you're up against established players. It's a huge change, I think, over the past 10 years as far as the maturation of the industry and the jobs that are tied to clean energy moving forward too.
Yeah, and I found that we've sort of moved from our infancy and youth to the more adolescent stage where before everyone wants to accommodate us, and now we're kind of becoming big, and occasionally we have our opponents, be it on land use or skepticism around whether or not the solar industry should organize. So can you talk a little bit about how the industry can best prepare to meet some of those challenges as we mature and become a growing force?
Sure, and David, I think you alluded to it perfectly. The land use fights, I think, going into 2022 are going to be the forefront of importance for your membership. I had to go look up exactly when Chairman Barve wrote the op-ed, but it was somewhere around crossover, in the Washington Post dealing with, the Montgomery County local decisions, where, Chairman Barve writing an op-ed says Montgomery County Council declared a climate emergency, then sabotage the solar program. And I think the opposition that you've seen against ground level solar from sort of the land preservation community, I think it's incumbent upon your members to sort of push back on that and the jobs and how we meet the clean energy requirements set forth from the legislature. I think ground level solar is a huge part of that, and storage as well. So I think that's probably first and foremost of, I think, things that you could mobilize against in 2022.
Mm-hmm. And Delegate Brooks, you obviously being from Baltimore County, you see this both as a resident, but also in your job in Annapolis. How would you respond to the same question I asked Jason?
Yeah, and if I could piggyback on what Jason just said too, yeah, that is a concern, especially with the farmers. But at the same time, what we can do and what we need to do, and actually, one of the things that we've done here in Baltimore County at the fairground, we put on all the buildings there, all the rooftops have solar. you know. And we can do that with all, say, new construction of schools, you know, make sure that they have solar, and you know, and by placing more solar on rooftops, you know, that would address some of those land use concerns. And at the same time, I think another big component that was mentioned was about the storage. I think that storage sort of brings that solar argument full circle, because we can mitigate some of our the problems that we have, because as we both know, that solar and wind is non-dispatchable. But during the time when the wind is not blowing as strong or the sun is not shining, then we can use that battery storage to power us on through. You know, so I think that sort of here again brings that that makes that circle brings that argument full circle, and as we place more emphasis on that. And I think I was reading where they've got these out in California, they've got some they're utilizing major new advancement in battery technology that's really helping address this concern about the non-dispatchable nature of solar and wind. Yes.
I'm glad you raised storage, because it's a great segue into my next question, which is going to be what do we expect in 2022? There were a number of bills that either crossed over and didn't make it to sine die, or they just got mired in committee. A lot of those had to do with either rooftop siting or reducing soft costs for the solar industry. And we also expect 2022 to be a kind of touchy year, because folks are going to be running for election or re-election. And so we're curious, you know, what are going to be some of these major energy discussions. So Delegate, if you had to look into a crystal ball and think about what might be coming through your committee, what do you think are going to be the hot topics?
Well, I think, well, of course, here again, going back to storage, of course, residential storage and commercial storage, those should be big items. Something else, David, I'd like to see that the ITC, the investment tax credit for investing in solar. You know, I think an incentive is probably one of the best things that one can do to get people to get involved. You know, and here again, mitigating some of that particular cost. So I think, if my memory serves me correct, this year it's down to 24%. This is on the federal level, and then it phases out completely for individuals. So if we can talk to some of our federal partners and get them to try to get that reinstituted, you know, I think that would go a long way in helping us to arrive at those goals that we set for 2030.
Yeah, and we were fortunate to get a 2-year extension at 26% in the ITC, but still, that's not a lot of time when you think about a lot of these projects and their cycle. So we hope to get a more permanent extension, and the Biden-Harris administration has a lot to do, especially as it relates to energy. But you know, we expect big changes with the ITC, and we hope that an extension is one of them. So Jason, what do you think is in the works for 2022? How do you see sort of the politics of both having it be an election year and some of these fights that didn't really get worked out at the end of the session? How do you think that'll play out?
So one of the things I think that's been a trend that I've seen over the years that is probably going to come up again in 2022 is, you know, as folks have sort of clean energy ideas or plans, you know, it involves budgeting is always a tricky thing. And folks either, you know, you don't want to cut another expenditure and you probably don't want to raise revenue. And you've seen folks say, well, how am I going to pay for this? Let's use SEEF money. And I think as folks sort of discover that SEEF is out there as a pot of money that's sort of recurring every year, I think it's incumbent to sort of protect the uses of it before it becomes too broad. You know, there have been some discussions about electrifying the state's vehicle fleet, you know, and using SEEF for that. I think there's been policy disagreements as to how much CEF money should be dedicated towards something like that, and whether those costs should be appropriated elsewhere. So I think CEF and sort of its uses will be, at the forefront, especially in a year when folks might not want to raise, a ton of revenue to solve some of these things. And, and obviously, where we go on climate solutions, I think that remains to be seen. I mean, I know that there were some disagreements between the House and the Senate, and hopefully they can get worked out over the interim on a sustainable long-term plan for the state moving forward.
Yeah, and Dave, if I could say something else too, I think probably there, oftentimes we hear about clean energy, and we also hear about renewable energy, and there might be a push to get the nuclear component back into the argument, and as we know, yeah, nuclear is clean, but at the same time, the problem is the spent fuel, and oftentimes my argument is that the uranium ore necessary for nuclear fuel production only exists in finite quantities. So therefore, it might last a long time, but it is not renewable. So we got to let people know that that's definitely the situation there. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. You see a movement towards zero emission RECs, and folks are getting creative about how to include nuclear as part of some sort of incentive program in order to keep plants alive. Actually, up in New York, they just closed a nuclear plant, and so I'm sure there's going to be folks saying, "Well, we don't want the same thing to happen to Calvert Cliffs." That's an important point. And Jason, you also made a point about CEF funds, and I do think the industry should recognize that these funds in part support both residential and commercial solar, as well as community solar for low to moderate income families. And so we are going to have to be pretty protective of some of these funds, and also make sure that CEF doesn't become this Christmas tree of funding sources. And so I think, one of the silver linings about having the Climate Solutions Act not get across the finish line this year was it gives us a time to step back and say, how are we responsibly thinking about these public funds, and can we do it in a way that doesn't become a Christmas tree that folks can tack on to from year to year. So I want to bring in Todd Chase into this discussion, because as the final bill that we're going to talk about is HB 777. Now, this was a key piece of legislation that really supported the permitting process for utility scale projects, and Delegate Brooks, you were the primary sponsor. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about the legislation, and Todd, I'll turn the moderator role over to you.
Okay, sure. Yeah, HB 777. That was the bill that sort of, the power plant research program, they review the application for a CPCN, and oftentimes those when those applications are submitted, a decision may not necessarily be made on them in what we would consider a reasonable time, and that would leave that out there. So primarily, what this bill does is that once the PPRP reviews that application, once that application has been submitted and they review it, they've got 6 months to make a decision, either approve or non-approval to the PSC, and so that final decision can be made, and so things can go ahead and move forward. That's the gist of the bill.
Thank you, Delegate Brooks, and thank you, David, for tossing it over to us. And a big thanks to Delegate Brooks and to Chesa for your leadership during the course of this session. Let me start off with just a couple of quick intros. You've already seen Jason Weintraub. Also on the meeting here are Michael Powell, who's a member of our Energy and Environment Group, as well as Caroline Sweet and Danielle Zoller, who are folks within our real estate team. But the primary focus over the next little bit is going to be on Maggie Witherup and David Bugelmans, also members of the Energy and Environment team. And I'm going to ask them a few questions. Let me first start by observing that I really think the last 4-month period has been historic for Maryland Solar, which is really saying something, given that this is an industry that's often compared to drinking from a fire hose. And it's also, I think, remarkable that you're saying that in a session where a major climate bill failed at the last minute. It gives you some perspective on just how much has happened. And I think as we're sort of writing this first draft of history, I'm predicting that over the next few years, the 2021 session is going to be pointed to, along with the action in Baltimore at the Public Service Commission, as really being remarkable. Our time is short, and so we're going to try to give you guys an idea of what these bills and the regulatory developments that have occurred are actually going to mean on the ground, right? We've talked at sort of the politics and the policy level for the first half of this discussion, and now we're going to get into what are the practical considerations and what does all of this mean. Delegate Brooks just started off with sort of an overview of what HB 777 does, and I want to pick up on that with David. David, good afternoon again. And could you summarize sort of the big process takeaways from the legislation?
Sure. So I thought the delegate did a good job of describing the bill, but I could maybe take a step back and, as a practitioner, does a lot of these CPCNs explain the benefits of it, the way that I view it. HB 777 is fairly technical, but it does make several very important changes. As the delegate explained, PPRP, the Power Plant Research Program, is a very important participant in these cases. And what it does is it does a comprehensive environmental review on behalf of the state government and then submits licensing conditions that govern the construction and operation of the solar project once the CPCN is granted. And as anyone who's developed one of these projects knows, those conditions are extremely important in terms of what you have to do once you get the permit. And I guess backing up even further, a CPCN is needed to construct a solar facility 2 megawatts AC or larger in the state, and it preempts local zoning. So it's kind of the permit to construct for these projects. The issue under current law is that PPRP, if it opposes a project, is not required to submit the results of its review or conditions to the PSC. And because PPRP is so important, if they don't submit that, it makes it almost impossible for the commission to grant a CPCN. It's theoretically possible, but practically speaking, it's not. So that allowed PPRP to exert significant leverage over the process. And for some more controversial projects, it held them up for multiple years. So HB 777 makes several important improvements to correct this. As the delegate said, the bill requires now PPRP to submit the results of its review within 6 months of when the application is deemed complete. So that provides some additional certainty for developers, potentially could shorten the time frame of these applications. And then it also requires PPRP to always submit its review and conditions, even if it's recommending denial. So it allows the commission, if it disagrees with PPRP, to grant a CPCN. So that's very technical sounding, but it is a very significant change in how this will work. And then finally, in addition to all of that, the bill makes some changes to require PPRP's conditions to be consistent with state environmental laws, which again will hopefully provide some additional certainty for developers moving forward. So again, this is a fairly substantial bill that Delegate Brooks sponsored. And as a practitioner, I think it's going to make a major difference.
Now, at the same time that HB 777 was moving through Annapolis, there were also important and related regulatory changes occurring at the Public Service Commission in the form of Rulemaking 72, right?
Yeah, that's right. RM 72 kind of fits into HB 777. It's a little bit different in terms of what it does, but together, I think the result will be a significant improvement. RM72, the rules, the rulemaking was a few weeks ago, and the commission voted to publish the rules. And, you know, so there's some process left, but we have a good picture of what's going to be in the final version. There's three main changes. The first is that for the first time, the commission has implemented a pre-application consultation process where 90 days before an application is submitted, projects need to submit certain information to local governments where the projects will be located, so the local government can provide feedback on whether a project is consistent with the zoning ordinance of the local government and the jurisdiction's comprehensive plan. The intent of this is to create kind of a defined way that the local government can provide input on zoning issues, which is an important part of the commission's consideration and has created some uncertainty for projects. In terms of, you know, what to look at if you're developing one of these projects is keep in mind the 90 days and make sure you work that in so you get your application to the local government in time so you can file your actual CPCN application consistent with when you'd like to. The second and third changes are interrelated. And what they do is they more clearly define how the commission reviews an application once it gets it to determine if the application is complete. And then it also fine tunes and improves the list of things that are actually required for a complete application, and then creates like a literal checklist of what you need for a complete application. So under the proposed rules, within 45 days of receiving an application and delegating the case to a judge, PPRP needs to file a letter saying you've checked the boxes or you've not checked the boxes. And in terms of what the commission looks at, it is now limited to only what's in the checklist, which is an issue that we faced with some projects where the requirements for what the commission or PPRP wanted seem to shift from project to project. So it'll clarify how that initial completeness review works, and then create a more defined kind of realm of what you need to put into the application. So again, this all may sound fairly technical, but the combination of RM72 and HB 777, I think, will be to improve how these cases work, hopefully reduce the amount of time and increase certainty for developers.
Thanks, David. That's really helpful. I want to bring Maggie into the conversation. This bill and this rulemaking didn't happen in a vacuum, right? I mean, this was all brought about. You don't have major changes for the first time in 40 years to a process just out of thin air. What really led to these changes? And could you tell us a little bit about the Biggs Ford case?
Sure. Thanks, Todd. And thank you, Delegate Brooks, for being here today and for sponsoring this bill. As Todd said, this, when you see a piece of legislation, you sometimes wonder where it came from. Was this really a problem before this? And I'm here to tell you, yes, it was a problem with at least one project that we dealt with. And it's known as the Biggs Ford project. It's in Frederick County. And what happened with this project was we had filed a CPCN application, was working its way through the process. And halfway through the CPCN process, the county changed its zoning ordinance and enacted a new requirement for utility scale solar projects in the county, required those projects to apply for a new zoning application called a floating zone, kind of like an overlay, and imposed so many requirements on getting that floating zone that our project would not have met several of the criteria. And we believe that there was almost no parcel in the entire county that would have been able to satisfy all of the criteria to get a floating zone. And so we made the argument that to the public utility law judge that this ordinance is really a de facto ban on all utility scale solar in the county. And therefore, Public Service Commission, you don't need to give any significant weight to that, because Public Service Commission CPCN proceedings preempt local zoning. This was before the perennial case by the Court of Appeals, which reaffirmed that, yes, the Public Service Commission process does preempt local zoning. But PPRP took the position in that case that because the county opposed the project and because our applicant had not gone through the floating zone process, which was just put in place halfway through the CPCN process, that PPRP was unable to complete its review of the project, and they refused to propose any licensing conditions for the project. Now, we took the position that we could propose our own licensing conditions. And if you've done a number of these projects, you see that the solar licensing conditions are very much the same from one project to the next. And so we cobbled together PPRP's standard conditions and proposed those as our licensing conditions. And the Public Utility Law Judge actually agreed with us that the Frederick County ordinance did constitute a de facto ban on all utility scale solar projects in the county, but was very reluctant to approve the project without PPRP's blessing on licensing conditions. And he believed that some of the conditions we proposed were a little bit vague, and so recommended denial of the project. And the commission also was reluctant to grant the CPCN without having a firm recommendation and licensing conditions from PPRP. And so they recommended denial of the CPCN. The applicant chose to go back through the new floating zone application process at the county level. As we predicted, they did not meet all the criteria. The application was denied. We went back to the CPCN process. And the second time around, the Public Utility Law Judge did order PPRP to propose licensing conditions and submit a recommendation. And that time around, the Public Utility Law Judge did recommend approval of the CPCN. But we went through a whole year and a half that could have been avoided if PPRP had just done its review, which it was not bound by the county. But for whatever reason, they felt that they could not complete their review and held up this project for a year and a half. So this bill and the new regulations will change that process and hopefully streamline and make the CPCN process better for everybody. So thank you, Delegate Brooks. It will have a real world impact on these projects.
Yeah.
As you can see, the scars run deep. And so thank you all for participating in Maggie's therapy session here this afternoon. Let's talk about one other piece of RM72, David. Sometimes what happens is almost as, what doesn't happen is almost as important as what does happen. There was another piece to RM72 that wasn't ultimately adopted. What is it and why is that important?
Sure. So the original intent or our understanding of it for RM72 was to do what I previously described. There was more procedural focus, the checklist for complete application. But sometimes what you see when the agency does a rulemaking is they try to include other changes that are only somewhat related to kind of the focus of the rulemaking. So this is an example of that. What the commission staff had proposed initially in the rulemaking was to change effectively what type of projects need a CPCN. It's a little convoluted how they were going to do that related to like a 1 mile rule. And I don't think we need to get into the specifics. The end result would have been for developers that are doing multiple co-located aggregate net meter projects, which is a fairly common practice. The change would have roped them into the CPCN process, which would have been fundamentally different than the status quo for the past 5 or so years. At the hearing, the industry showed up in force, and thanks to that pushback, the commissioners actually agreed with stakeholders to remove that change from the rules. So at least for now, our view is that the status quo still stands. And we don't see the commission going down this road or making these types of changes in the foreseeable future. That doesn't mean it's never going to happen, because regulations, although there's a process an agency has to go through to change them, they can always change. But for the immediate future, we think the status quo in terms of whether a CPCN is needed is the same as it was before. So kind of escape that fairly significant change a few weeks ago.
Yeah, and I think that sort of logically leads us into talking about the net metering increase, which Delegate Brooks touched on during his portion of the presentation, HB 569. Maggie, could you talk a little bit more about what that bill does and why it's important?
Sure. This is a fairly simple bill. Under current law, there's a statewide limit on net metering capacity of 1,500 megawatts. And this bill doubles that limit to 3,000 megawatts as of October 1st.
And David, I think most of us have understood for a while that we haven't even been all that close to the 1,500 megawatts. Why is this such a significant change going to 3,000 megawatts?
So it's significant from really a policy perspective at the Public Service Commission, because the net metering cap has been used by the commission staff and the commission ultimately to limit net metering in different contexts. So for instance, with the change I was just discussing about trying to rope aggregate meter projects into the CPCN process, one of the justifications there from the staff was we're concerned about hitting the 1,500 megawatt cap. In the community solar program, the cap's been used by staff, and the commission, at least until now, has agreed that that's a justification for limiting the size of the community solar program. So by doubling the cap and making it less likely we will hit it in the immediate term or in the next 5 or so years, it will hopefully increase the willingness of regulators to allow for more capacity of the community solar program, and just kind of change the discussion related to net metering.
Fingers crossed on that one. Let's go back to Senate Bill 65 for a minute. This is the removal of black liquor and the change to the SRECs. David talked a little bit about that one. Maggie, can you tell us in a little bit more detail what the changes are to the SRECs under that bill?
Yeah, so originally this started as just the removal of black liquor from the Tier 1 qualifying biomass, but in the amendments, it did reduce the amount of solar energy required under the RPS each year from 2022 through 2029. And the reason for this was, I think, to recognize that solar projects were just not coming online fast enough to meet the percentages. And so this was a more realistic approach, and avoiding having massive alternative compliance payments in the meantime until solar can catch up with the carve out. I think it will reduce the number of SRECs for the near term future, but will increase the value in the long run.
So the first few minutes of this portion of the presentation have again focused on the nuts and the bolts and practical considerations of some of the bills that did pass. But I think that this industry's interest is broader than just the nuts and bolts and what's going to result in solar in the ground. And I think most folks within this industry also consider themselves to be environmentalists and conservationists at heart. I want to talk for a couple of minutes about two bills that didn't pass. One again that was mentioned earlier on was HB 66, which is the Coal Community Transition Act. And Michael, you were involved in this bill, and I'm interested in what your thoughts are on its prospects next year and in future years.
Involved in the bill, and of course we have the sponsor of the bill here with us today, and I certainly would defer to him. I had represented in that matter the coal burning power plants, which did not object to the bill that Delegate Brooks had put in, setting a date on them. I believe, and Delegate Brooks can certainly correct me if he disagrees, the issue was organized labor more than anything else. There was some cost concerns about the employee transition costs that were called for. But the AFL-CIO came out very strongly against any bill that set a firm deadline for the closure of the plants, even though those coal burning plants agreed. And Delegate Brooks, if you have a different view of that, or please chime in.
Yeah, well, Michael, you're on point with that. One of the things that was the decision had been made that the plants were going to be closing, you know, and I think some folks had some concerns about, you know, say codifying a particular closing date, you know, and you know, and I guess I can understand, you know, that you know that position, but here again, I didn't think that the environmentalists, anyone had that kind of power where they could force a company to close. I thought the decision was made primarily for economic reasons, you know. But here again, we want to get all of the stakeholders involved, and perhaps I think you know, in the coming next year, year after, you know, everyone can come together and then come to some type of conclusion on the best way forward. We definitely want to remove one of the dirtiest source of fuel in the world, and try to figure out what way we can accomplish address their concerns at the same time accomplishing the goal of doing away with this dirty fuel. So
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think for economic reasons, all the coal burning plants are going to close anyway, and they've all announced dates, I think, except for AES Warrior Run, which will close when their existing contract ends. So we're seeing that transition. And then at the same time, I serve on the Maryland Climate Change Commission as the business representative. And there, clearly our projections call for all of the coal burning power plants to close, and a significant reduction in natural gas production as well over a longer time. So we're going to see that in order to meet the deadlines in the existing law for greenhouse gas reduction. There's going to have to be major changes in the energy production sector.
yeah, and I think also trying to come up with a plan, a way to sort of mitigate some of the concerns, the consequences that those impacted workers are going to face, you know. So, you know, here again, that's something I guess we all need to get together, sit at a table and see. And figure out
the workers and the local jurisdictions, the property tax consequences are going to be huge.
Yeah, they'll be impacted as well. So, yes.
And as long as I'm stealing panelists from David, I'm going to steal Jason back for a minute on SB 414. Jason, can you talk a little bit about the last minute wrangling? I think a lot of us were surprised that this didn't ultimately result in a compromise on sine die to get the bill through. And I'm also interested in your thoughts on what it may take, what compromises may come into play to actually get it across the goal line, because I think most people believe it will eventually get there.
I think that's right, Todd. I think a lot of folks were surprised that there wasn't sort of that sine die miracle of getting this across in some form. I think a lot of it probably came down to the technical challenges of doing that. And, you've got a major bill with substantive amendments in a different posture. I think that was probably some of the sine die limitations. But as Delegate Brooks alluded to, and Michael as well, with, cold transition and in this virtual session, where legislators and staff aren't, as interactive with one another as they normally would be, I think that played a big part in it. Ultimately, you had two chairmen with very differing views on how to go about a major climate bill like this. And I think, this was a session that proved much harder to negotiate and compromise up until down to the wire than normally would be. So I think everybody is confident that it'll probably get done next session. I think unfortunately the tail end of Sine Die weekend unfortunately just couldn't get there.
And so before I ask my last couple of questions in this section, I just want to remind folks that we are coming up on Q&A. And so be thinking about your questions, and you can just ask them live, or you can type them into the chat group that's there. You can click on that on the bottom of your screen. One other question that I wanted to follow up on that David had touched on earlier was this notion of dealing with industry opponents, because as any industry matures, as solar has, it's naturally going to develop folks with counter interests. Not that they necessarily oppose the idea of solar, but that particularly when it comes to siting, there are often issues about that. And we on the ground who are involved with the permitting piece have an interesting perspective on this. And so David Bugelmans, I wanted to call you back and get your thoughts on how you've seen folks make inroads with opponents, and sort of where you think the counter arguments for solar come in, and how we might be able to deal with that, because no matter how comprehensive these statutes and regulations are, they won't change the fact that there will always be this push and pull over the use of land for solar. It's always going to take up space, and it's always competing with other interests. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, I could probably write a book about this, so I'll try to keep it short and talk about
Don't write any books right now.
Some high-level ideas, but in terms of pushing back against opposition, especially with respect to ground mount and utility scale solar, a couple arguments that I think have a lot of merit are, first, the idea that if you were to project out the amount of solar that we need to meet the current RPS obligation, even if you built all of it on farmland, it would only take, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but it's something like 2% of all farmland in the state. And that's kind of an aggressive projection. That's not the reality, right? Because a lot of this is going to be rooftop and projects that aren't on farmland. So I think if you, if you put things into context, sometimes you have opponents who I think have deeply held views about, solar on farmland and the impacts to the farming and that kind of thing. But if you take a step back and actually show, okay, what's the actual impact? It really is small. So that's one idea. Another one is the concept that, in terms of interconnection capacity, these projects can't go anywhere, especially on the utility scale side. And anyone who develops these projects already knows this, but what you're looking for is the ability to interconnect to the grid and output a certain amount of capacity into the grid at a reasonable cost. So typically, you're going to be siting close to a substation or a transmission line. And so sometimes you see opponents who think that we're going to pave the entire, not pave, but cover the entire jurisdiction or county in solar panels. The reality is that you may see some clusters or projects close to transmission infrastructure or distribution infrastructure, more major infrastructure, but it's not random and it's not going to be everywhere. So I don't know. Those are two arguments, Todd. I don't know if you have any other points you think I should stress, but.
No, I just think that's helpful. I think it's helpful for the policy and politics folks to hear sort of what we see on the ground and to be thinking about that, because the first step to ever dealing with opponents is recognizing that they exist and what their issues are. And I think it better positions the industry as a whole to be able to deal with those. I'm about to hand this back over to David for the Q&A. I see a couple of questions that have popped up. I do just really for a moment want to take a second and thank Debbie Henry and Stephanie Forbes-Glave, who are on this meeting. They are our marketing folks who have done a lot of work to be able to bring together this presentation today. So I just wanted to acknowledge them and say thank you to both of them. them. David, I think the floor is yours again.
Great. Thank you, Todd. And hearing your crisp voice come out over the webinar, I got to get myself one of those headsets because it really does make a big difference.
You don't think it's just my natural voice?
That too, probably. So we've had a few questions come in. One is on recording. I believe our fantastic Debbie Henry did record it at the top, and so we'll do our best to share it with our respective circles when it's all said and done. So the first question comes to us about the net metering bill. As other David pointed out, it means a lot for both the community solar and the residential commercial industry. Do we expect that bill to be vetoed? I'm not sure if Delegate Brooks, you've heard anything, or Jason. I know that there was some opposition, especially from the IOUs on this bill, but I imagine that the governor might, weigh his options here.
Well, I haven't heard anything about a veto on that. Well, if it does, we'll see what the leadership says, and then we do have the ability to, perhaps address that concern. So.
I think that's right. I think the one thing that the Democratic General Assembly has shown is a willingness to override vetoes if they may come. So that would be my guess.
I think if the governor vetoed this bill and the General Assembly did not override it, it would be the first veto that they let stand. So it shows you the relationship between the two bodies. The next one is for you, Delegate. So some of your colleagues and have expressed a fatigue on continuing to tweak the RPS. I've only been involved in this for 4 years, and every year there's an RPS fight in some way or another. On the other hand, others view the General Assembly is supposed to be hands-on in reacting to market conditions and really playing an active role in transforming the electric grid. So, Cyrus, what are your thoughts on that balance? So we as a solar community can be sensitive to those two kind of competing ideologies.
Well, we try to, in the legislature, we try to be balanced as well. We try to, that's why we have hearings and whatnot. We listen to both sides of the argument, both sides of the concerns. And oftentimes, I remember when I first got in the legislature, it's the difficult part. You think that you can listen to two arguments and on different sides of the concern, and both people be right. So you listen, and if we've introduced legislation, we've set some goals, we're trying to achieve those goals, then I think perhaps we should continue to move forward to that aim. But at the same time, of course, listening to and understanding people who are on the other side of the issue. So,
if I can just briefly chime in on that, David, remember that one of the things the legislature passed was a Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act that established a Maryland Climate Commission that is supposed to come back with plans for meeting certain greenhouse gas reductions targets. And that commission recommended that, in fact, we adjust one of the targets from a 40% to a 50% reduction by 2030. You have to figure that commission is going to make recommendations to the General Assembly for further reductions. I don't know whether it'll, at the end of the day, will change to the RPS. I know we'll be making changes on vehicles and buildings. So you can expect that there will be proposals for changes pretty much continuously as we pursue the ultimate goal of a net zero by 2045. There's no way to do it without changing the law.
And one final anecdote is I feel like we live in an industry that's constantly changing. In Virginia, people talked about battery storage as this thing. Yeah, in a couple years, and then all of a sudden, bam, all of my members cared about energy storage and wanted to know the permitting regime, wanted to get legislation passed. And so because we're in this dynamic and evolving space, legislation needs to reflect those changing technologies and evolving uses of those technologies. I realized too, we never opened up the floor to folks that want to ask questions via Zoom. So folks, feel free. Now is your time to unmute and ask a question to any of our panelists here.
Everybody's probably taking a bite of lunch at this exact moment, David. You didn't give them any warning.
Yeah, exactly. I've been on the other end of that many a time. If there are no additional questions, I just again want to recognize Debbie and Stephanie for their work on this, and thank you to Delegate Brooks and the entire Gordon Feinblatt team for this fantastic presentation. I think we covered all segments of the solar industry, and come back and see us in a year, and I'm sure there'll be a whole new set of issues to talk about. So thank you again to everybody for participating, and looking forward to being in touch.
Hi, David. Good enough.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Likewise.
Take care.